She was supposed to be home by midnight. That was the promise she made to her mother before walking out the front door on a crisp October evening in 2015. Her name was Bethany Chambers, and she was 17 years old, with dreams as wide as the English countryside and a smile that could light up the darkest room. She left her home in a small village just outside Manchester with nothing but her phone, a small purse, and the excitement of meeting someone she had only known through glowing screens and late-night messages. Bethany never came home that night. She never texted her mother goodnight. She never answered the dozens of calls that would flood her phone over the following hours, days, and weeks. For 8 long years, her family lived in a nightmare without answers, clinging to hope that grew thinner with each passing season. But here is what nobody expected, what nobody could have predicted, what would eventually rock an entire community to its core. The person responsible for Bethany's disappearance was not a stranger lurking in the shadows of the internet. It was someone who had attended her birthday party just 2 months before, someone who had sung happy birthday while she blew out candles, someone who had smiled at her parents and shaken her father's hand. The arrest that came in 2023 would expose a truth so chilling, so close to home, that it would force an entire nation to question who they really trust. If you are watching this right now, I need you to do something before we continue. I need you to share this video with someone you care about, someone who needs to hear this story because the lessons buried in these next few chapters could save a life. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because stories like this one remind us why we must never stop paying attention. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Bethany Chambers grew up in a village called Thornbury Green, a place where everybody knew everybody, where doors were left unlocked and children played in the streets until the sun dipped below the horizon. Her father, Michael Chambers, worked as a mechanic at the local garage, his hands permanently stained with oil and his heart permanently devoted to his family. Her mother, Susan Chambers, was a teaching assistant at the primary school, known throughout the community for her gentle nature and her homemade lemon drizzle cake that she brought to every village fete. They were simple people with simple dreams, and their greatest achievement, in their own words, was their daughter. Bethany was the kind of teenager who defied the stereotypes that newspapers loved to print about her generation. Yes, she was always on her phone, always scrolling through social media, always connected to some invisible network that her parents could never fully understand. But she was also kind to a fault, volunteering at the local animal shelter every Saturday morning, helping elderly neighbors with their shopping, and maintaining grades that made her parents beam with pride. She wanted to study veterinary medicine at university, a dream she had carried since she was 8 years old and nursed a wounded bird back to health in her bedroom. In the summer of 2015, Bethany turned 17. Her parents threw her a party in their modest back garden, stringing fairy lights through the apple tree and setting up a table with enough food to feed the entire village. Friends came from school, neighbors stopped by, and even a few of her parents' colleagues made an appearance to wish her well. It was a beautiful evening, captured in dozens of photographs that would later become painful artifacts for a family searching for answers. In those photos, Bethany is radiant, surrounded by people who claim to love her, unaware that among them stood someone with intentions darker than anyone could imagine. The summer faded into autumn, and with it came the new school year, the changing leaves, and a subtle shift in Bethany's behavior that her parents would later dissect in agonizing detail. She became more secretive with her phone, tilting the screen away when her mother walked past, staying up later than usual, and spending more time alone in her room. Susan Chambers noticed, but convinced herself it was normal teenage behavior, the natural pulling away that every adolescent goes through as they approach adulthood. Michael Chambers was even less concerned, trusting his daughter implicitly and believing that she would come to them if anything was truly wrong. What they did not know was that Bethany had met someone online, someone who called themselves Jamie, and claimed to be a 19-year-old university student from Liverpool. The messages had started innocently enough, a random comment on one of Bethany's photos that had evolved into daily conversations, then nightly phone calls, then something that felt, to Bethany at least, like love. Jamie was everything she had dreamed about, attentive and charming and interested in every detail of her life. Jamie remembered the small things, her favorite songs, her fears about the future, the name of the bird she had saved when she was 8. To Bethany, it felt like fate. On the evening of October 17th, 2015, Bethany told her parents she was going to meet a friend from school. She was vague about the details, mentioning a coffee shop in Manchester and promising she would be back before midnight. Susan Chambers offered to drive her to the train station, but Bethany declined, insisting she wanted to walk, that the fresh air would do her good. She kissed her mother on the cheek, hugged her father briefly, and stepped out into the twilight. That was the last time Michael and Susan Chambers ever saw their daughter walk through their front door. The hours that followed would become a blur in their memories, a cascade of growing concern that transformed into full-blown panic. At midnight, when Bethany had not returned, Susan sent a text message asking where she was. No response. At 12:30, Michael called her phone, only to hear it ring and ring before going to voicemail. By 1 in the morning, both parents were pacing the living room, their calls to Bethany's friends yielding no information, their attempts to reach her becoming increasingly desperate. By 3 in the morning, they had called the police. The investigation that would follow would consume their lives, their community, and eventually, the national consciousness. But in those first terrifying hours, Michael and Susan Chambers were just two parents praying that their daughter had simply lost track of time, that she would walk through the door at any moment with an apologetic smile and a reasonable explanation. They could not have known that their nightmare was only beginning, that the search for Bethany would span years, that the truth would be buried under layers of deception so intricate that even seasoned detectives would struggle to unravel them. The first 48 hours after a person goes missing are critical, and the police in Manchester understood this better than anyone. By dawn on October 18th, a missing person report had been filed, and officers were already beginning to piece together Bethany's movements from the previous evening. CCTV footage from the train station showed her boarding a train to Manchester at approximately 7:30 in the evening. She was alone, her phone pressed to her ear, a small smile playing on her lips as she spoke to whoever was on the other end. That smile would haunt her parents for years, a reminder of how happy she had seemed, how completely unaware she was of what awaited her. Detective Inspector Helen Parker was assigned to lead the investigation, a veteran officer with over 2 decades of experience and a reputation for never giving up on a case. From the very beginning, she sensed that something was deeply wrong. Missing persons cases involving teenagers often resolve themselves within days, runaways returning home or being found at friends' houses, young people who had simply lost track of time. But Bethany Chambers did not fit the profile of a runaway. Her bank account had not been touched. Her passport was still in her bedroom. There was no evidence of conflict at home, no history of rebellion or risky behavior. Everything pointed to a girl who had intended to come back. The investigation began with Bethany's phone records, and what detectives found there would set the tone for everything that followed. Over the preceding months, Bethany had exchanged thousands of messages with a contact saved simply as J. The messages painted a picture of an intense emotional connection, a relationship that had developed entirely online and had recently escalated to plans for an in-person meeting. The final message Bethany had sent to this contact, just minutes before she boarded the train, read simply, "On my way. Can't wait to finally see you." Tracing the contact proved to be more difficult than anyone anticipated. The phone number associated with J was registered to a prepaid SIM card, purchased with cash from a supermarket and offering no identifying information. The social media account through which Bethany had initially connected with this person had been deleted, leaving only fragments of data that forensic analysts struggled to reconstruct. Whoever had been communicating with Bethany had taken considerable steps to remain anonymous, a red flag that sent chills down Detective Parker's spine. Meanwhile, the community of Thornbury Green rallied around the Chambers family in a way that would become a defining characteristic of the case. Search parties were organized within days, volunteers combing through fields and forests, checking abandoned buildings and railway lines. desperately hoping to find some trace of the missing girl. Flyers with Bethany's smiling face were posted in every shop window, on every lamppost, on every community notice board. Her photograph appeared on local news broadcasts, then national ones, as the story of the missing teenager captured the public's imagination and concern. Susan Chambers gave tearful interviews to journalists, pleading with anyone who had information to come forward. Michael Chambers stood beside her, stoic but visibly broken, his hands clenched at his sides as he addressed the cameras. They spoke of their daughter's kindness, her dreams, her love for animals, hoping that humanizing her would inspire someone, somewhere, to provide the breakthrough they needed. The community responded with an outpouring of support, organizing fundraisers and vigils, offering prayers and practical assistance in equal measure. But despite all the attention, despite all the searching, no trace of Bethany was found. As weeks turned into months, the investigation continued but began to lose momentum. Other cases demanded attention, resources were stretched thin, and the leads that had once seemed promising dried up one by one. Detective Parker refused to close the case, keeping the file on her desk as a constant reminder of the young girl who had vanished into thin air. But even she had to admit, privately and painfully, that the trail had gone cold. For the Chambers family, life became a series of agonizing rituals. They kept Bethany's bedroom exactly as she had left it, her books stacked on her desk, her clothes hanging in her closet, her posters of veterinary schools still taped to the walls. They celebrated her birthdays every year, lighting candles on a cake that no one would eat, singing happy birthday to an empty chair. They marked anniversaries of her disappearance with renewed media appeals, each one a little less covered than the last, as the public's attention inevitably waned. Susan Chambers fell into a depression that would consume the next years of her life. She stopped working, stopped socializing, stopped being able to function in any meaningful way. Michael Chambers threw himself into his work, spending longer and longer hours at the garage, using physical labor to distract himself from the unbearable grief that threatened to swallow him whole. Their marriage, once rock solid, began to show cracks under the weight of their shared trauma. They loved each other, but they did not know how to grieve together, each of them retreating into their own private hell. The community of Thornberry Green, for all its initial support, eventually moved on. Life continued, as it always does, and while the residents never forgot Bethany, she faded from active conversation into the realm of tragic memory. Her name became a cautionary tale told to teenagers, a reminder of the dangers of the internet, a ghost story that parents invoked to keep their children close. But for Michael and Susan Chambers, Bethany was not a cautionary tale. She was their daughter, and she was missing, and they would never stop waiting for her to come home. Years passed with agonizing slowness. 2016 brought no answers, only renewed pain on the anniversary of Bethany's disappearance. 2017 was the same, and 2018, and each year after that. Detective Parker retired from the force in 2020, but not before passing Bethany's file to a younger detective named James Morrison, making him promise that he would never let the case be forgotten. Morrison took that promise seriously, reviewing the evidence with fresh eyes, running names through databases that had not existed in 2015, hoping that technology might provide what traditional detective work had not. In the autumn of 2022, 7 years after Bethany Chambers had disappeared, Detective James Morrison was sitting at his desk reviewing cold cases when something caught his eye. A new forensic database had been implemented across UK law enforcement, one that could cross-reference digital footprints in ways that had been impossible just a few years earlier. On a hunch, Morrison decided to run the fragmentary data from the deleted social media account through this new system, expecting nothing but doing his due diligence. What came back changed everything. The system identified a pattern of activity that matched the deleted account to another profile, one that had been created shortly after the original was deleted and had been used for years afterward. This new profile belonged to someone named Thomas Whitfield, a 28-year-old man who lived in Manchester and worked as a sales representative for a pharmaceutical company. Morrison stared at the screen, his heart beginning to race as he clicked through Whitfield's publicly available information. The photograph that appeared made Morrison's blood run cold. He recognized that face, not from any police database, but from the case file he had studied countless times over the past 2 years. Thomas Whitfield had attended Bethany Chambers' 17th birthday party. He was in the background of several photographs, smiling along with everyone else, raising a glass to toast the birthday girl. He was a cousin of one of Bethany's school friends, someone who had been briefly interviewed by police in the initial investigation and quickly eliminated as a person of interest. Morrison spent the next several weeks building a case, working quietly and methodically to avoid alerting Whitfield to the investigation. He obtained warrants for phone records, financial data, and digital communications. He interviewed witnesses who had been at the birthday party, carefully probing for any information about Whitfield's behavior that evening. He consulted with forensic psychologists about the profile of predators who groom victims online, learning that many such offenders deliberately cultivate real-world relationships to establish trust and gather information. The picture that emerged was horrifying. Thomas Whitfield had been at that birthday party deliberately, having manipulated his cousin into bringing him along specifically so he could observe Bethany in person. He had gathered details about her life, her interests, her vulnerabilities, and then used that information to create a persona that would be irresistible to her. Jamie was not a random stranger from the internet, but a calculated construction, designed by someone who already knew exactly what Bethany wanted to hear. The phone records told the rest of the story. Calls between Whitfield's personal phone and the prepaid SIM associated with Jamie proved that he had been operating both devices. Financial records showed purchases of the prepaid phone, gifts that had been sent to Bethany under the guise of romantic gestures, and a train ticket to Manchester on the evening of October 17, 2015. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, and Morrison knew he was getting close to something that had eluded investigators for 7 years. I want to pause here and ask you something important. As you are listening to this story, think about the people in your own life, the ones who show up at family gatherings and community events, the ones you trust simply because they are familiar. How well do you really know them? What secrets might they be hiding behind their smiles? Leave a comment below and tell me what you think, because this question is at the heart of everything that happened next. The breakthrough came in March of 2023, when Morrison finally obtained a warrant to search Thomas Whitfield's property. By this point, Whitfield was living in a modest house on the outskirts of Manchester, having moved several times since 2015 in a pattern that now seemed designed to avoid establishing roots. The search team arrived at dawn, armed with a warrant and the weight of 8 years of unanswered questions. What they found in that house would provide the final pieces of a puzzle that had tormented a family and a community for the better part of a decade. In a locked room in the basement, hidden behind a false wall, investigators discovered a collection of items that left even hardened detectives shaken. Photographs of Bethany, taken without her knowledge in the weeks before her disappearance. Printed copies of their message history, preserved as though they were love letters. And most significantly, a pink scarf that Susan Chambers would later identify as one Bethany had been wearing the night she left home. But there was something else in that basement. Something that would transform this from a case of suspected abduction into something far more sinister and far more hopeful than anyone had dared to imagine. Because Thomas Whitfield had not disposed of all the evidence of his crime. He had kept something that he never should have kept, something that would finally provide answers to the question that had haunted the Chambers family for 8 agonizing years. The arrest of Thomas Whitfield on March 15, 2023, sent shockwaves through the community of Thornbury Green and beyond. News spread quickly that a suspect had been taken into custody in connection with Bethany Chambers' disappearance, and for the first time in nearly 8 years, the case was back in the national spotlight. Journalists descended on the village once again, cameras capturing the disbelief on the faces of residents who had known Whitfield as a peripheral figure in their community, someone who had attended local events and been welcomed into homes without a second thought. For Michael and Susan Chambers, the arrest brought a complicated mixture of emotions that defied simple description. There was relief, Certainly, the relief of finally knowing that someone was being held accountable after so many years of uncertainty. But there was also terror, a deep and paralyzing fear of what they might learn about their daughter's fate. They had spent 8 years clinging to hope, imagining scenarios in which Bethany might still be alive, might still come home. The arrest of a suspect meant that those imaginings would soon be replaced by facts, and facts, they knew, could be cruel. Detective Morrison visited the Chambers' home personally to inform them of the developments. He sat in their living room, the same room where they had paced and prayed on the night Bethany disappeared, and told them what the investigation had uncovered. He explained Whitfield's connection to the birthday party, the elaborate deception he had constructed, the evidence recovered from his basement. Susan Chambers wept silently as he spoke, her hand gripping her husband's so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Michael Chambers stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, processing information that confirmed his worst nightmares. But Morrison had one more piece of information to share, something he had deliberately saved for this moment because he wanted to deliver it in person, wanted to see the reaction on their faces when they heard it. The investigation was not over, he told them. There were leads that had emerged from the evidence, leads that suggested Bethany's story did not end in that basement in Manchester. For the first time in 8 years, there was a genuine possibility, supported by concrete evidence, that Bethany Chambers might still be alive. The details that had sparked this hope were as follows. Among the items recovered from Whitfield's basement were journals, handwritten records of his activities spanning years. These journals revealed a man consumed by obsession, a man who had believed himself to be in love with Bethany, and who had taken her not to harm her, but to keep her for himself. The journals described elaborate arrangements to hide someone, references to medications designed to ensure compliance, and most crucially, entries that continued well past 2015 and into subsequent years, suggesting that whoever he was hiding remained hidden for far longer than anyone had imagined. The search expanded rapidly. Investigators analyzed every detail of Whitfield's life, looking for properties he might have access to, connections who might be complicit, patterns that might reveal a second location. They interviewed his family, his co-workers, his casual acquaintances, building a picture of a man who led a double life, so completely compartmentalized that even those closest to him had no idea what secrets he harbored. The break came when investigators discovered that Whitfield's elderly grandmother owned a farmhouse in rural Wales, a property that had been largely abandoned for years following her move to a care home. Records showed that Whitfield had visited this property regularly, ostensibly to check on its condition, but with a frequency that far exceeded what simple maintenance would require. The property was remote, isolated from neighbors, and had been systematically upgraded with modern amenities despite its apparent abandonment, a detail that struck investigators as deeply suspicious. On April 2, 2023, a team of officers traveled to the farmhouse in Wales, uncertain of what they would find but prepared for anything. The property was set at the end of a long, winding driveway, surrounded by fields and forests, invisible from any public road. As they approached, everything seemed normal, just an old farmhouse slowly succumbing to time and neglect. But then one of the officers noticed something that made everyone stop in their tracks. There was smoke rising from the chimney. Someone was inside. The officers approached the farmhouse with extreme caution, unsure whether they were dealing with a hostage situation, an accomplice, or something else entirely. They called for backup and took positions around the property, cutting off any potential escape routes while waiting for the order to enter. The wait felt eternal, every second stretching into an eternity as they watched the smoke continue to rise from the chimney, proof that whoever was inside remained unaware of the small army surrounding them. When they finally entered the farmhouse, what they found would become one of the most talked about moments in British criminal history. The interior was surprisingly clean and well-maintained, a stark contrast to the dilapidated exterior. There was food in the kitchen, books on the shelves, and evidence of daily life everywhere they looked. And in the main living room, sitting in an armchair with a book in her lap, was a woman who looked up at them with an expression that combined fear, confusion, and something that might have been hope. She was thin and pale, with dark circles under her eyes and hair that showed signs of home cutting. She was dressed in simple clothes, nothing remarkable, and she wore no shoes. But her eyes, when they met those of the officers, were unmistakable. Detective Morrison, who had joined the team at the scene, felt his heart stop as he recognized the face he had studied in countless photographs over the past years. It was Bethany Chambers. She was 25 years old now, no longer the 17-year-old who had disappeared on an October evening 8 years earlier. But it was her, alive, breathing, real. The reunion that followed was the stuff of every parent's most desperate prayer. Michael and Susan Chambers were contacted immediately, and they made the journey to Wales in a state of disbelief that would not fully fade until they saw their daughter with their own eyes. The moment Susan Chambers walked into that farmhouse and saw Bethany standing there, alive, was captured by the body cameras of the officers present and would later be shared, with the family's permission, as a testament to the power of persistence and hope. Susan collapsed into her daughter's arms, weeping uncontrollably, repeating her name over and over as though trying to convince herself that this was real, that after 8 years of nightmares, her daughter was actually standing in front of her. Michael Chambers joined them moments later, wrapping both wife and daughter in an embrace that seemed to encompass all the pain and fear and longing of the past 8 years. They stood like that for a long time, the officers around them turning away to give them privacy, many wiping their own eyes at the sight. But the reunion, as beautiful as it was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. Bethany Chambers had been held captive for 8 years, subjected to psychological manipulation and isolation that had profoundly affected her mental state. She had been told that her parents did not want her anymore, that they had stopped looking for her, that the only person who loved her was Thomas Whitfield. She had been given medications that kept her compliant and confused, making it difficult for her to think clearly or plan an escape. She had been cut off from the outside world entirely, with no access to television, internet, or any form of media that might have told her that she was being searched for. The recovery process would take years, requiring intensive therapy and patient support from a family that had to learn how to reconnect with a daughter they had lost and who had lost herself. But through it all, one thing remained constant. Bethany was alive, and she was finally coming home. The trial of Thomas Whitfield began in January of 2024, nearly 9 years after he had taken Bethany Chambers from her family and her life. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with journalists, community members, and representatives of organizations advocating for victims of abduction and online predators. The Chambers family sat in the front row, united and determined, watching as the man who had stolen their daughter was finally forced to face justice. The prosecution's case was meticulous and devastating. They presented evidence of Whitfield's calculated grooming of Bethany, showing how he had gathered information about her at the birthday party and used it to construct a persona designed to win her trust. They traced his digital footprint, demonstrating how he had covered his tracks while maintaining communication with his victim. They presented testimony from experts on psychological manipulation, explaining how Whitfield had systematically broken down Bethany's sense of reality until she believed that captivity was her only option. Bethany herself testified, a moment that hushed the entire courtroom into absolute silence. She spoke clearly and calmly, describing her experiences with a courage that awed everyone present. She explained how she had initially believed she was meeting someone she loved, how the realization of the truth had come slowly and painfully, how she had eventually given up hope of rescue and resigned herself to a life that felt like a slow death. Her words were not bitter or angry, but simply honest, a recounting of facts that left no room for doubt about what had been done to her. The defense attempted to portray Whitfield as mentally ill rather than criminal, arguing that his obsession with Bethany was a form of delusion that mitigated his responsibility. But the prosecution countered with evidence of his careful planning, his deliberate deception, and his sustained effort to avoid detection over 8 years. This was not the behavior of a man lost in delusion, but of a calculating predator who knew exactly what he was doing and took great pains to ensure he could continue doing it. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Thomas Whitfield was convicted of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and multiple counts of psychological abuse. The judge, in delivering the sentence, described his crimes as among the most disturbing he had encountered in his career, a systematic violation of a young woman's life that had caused immeasurable suffering to her and her family. Whitfield was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another young person. As he was led from the courtroom, Michael Chambers stood and addressed him directly, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. He told Whitfield that he had failed, that despite 8 years of captivity, Bethany had survived, that the Chambers family was stronger than ever, and that Whitfield would spend the rest of his life knowing that love and hope had defeated his cruelty. The years following the trial were a time of healing for the Chambers family, a gradual process of rebuilding lives that had been shattered and reassembling pieces that had been scattered. Bethany worked with therapists who specialized in trauma recovery, slowly reclaiming her sense of self and her belief in a future worth living. It was not easy, and there were setbacks, dark days when the weight of what she had endured seemed too heavy to bear. But with the support of her family and a team of dedicated professionals, she made progress that once would have seemed impossible. Susan Chambers found new purpose in advocating for families of missing persons, using her experience to help others navigate the nightmare she had lived through. She spoke at conferences, appeared on television programs, and worked with law enforcement agencies to improve protocols for handling missing person cases. Her voice, once broken by grief, became a source of strength for countless other parents holding on to hope for their own children. Michael Chambers returned to his work at the garage, but also became involved in community efforts to educate young people about online safety. He gave talks at local schools, sharing his family's story in the hope that it might prevent other teenagers from falling into similar traps. He was not a natural public speaker, but his sincerity and his obvious love for his daughter made his words powerful in ways that polished rhetoric never could. The community of Thornberry Green, for its part, grappled with the revelation that a predator had walked among them undetected for years. There were difficult conversations about warning signs that had been missed, about the dangers of trusting people simply because they were familiar, about the importance of remaining vigilant even in places that felt safe. The community emerged from these conversations more united and more aware, determined that what had happened to Bethany would never happen to another child on their watch. As for Bethany herself, she eventually returned to her childhood dream of working with animals. She enrolled in university at the age of 27, surrounded by students nearly a decade younger than her, but undeterred by the unconventional path that had brought her there. She studied veterinary medicine with a focus that surprised her professors and impressed her classmates, channeling her experiences into a drive to heal and protect creatures who could not protect themselves. The little bird she had nursed to health at age 8 had planted a seed that even 8 years of captivity could not destroy. It is now 2025, and Bethany Chambers is about to turn 27. She is in her final year of veterinary studies, top of her class, with a bright future stretching out before her. She lives in a small apartment not far from her parents, close enough to visit regularly, but independent enough to build a life of her own. She has friends, colleagues, and a therapist she still sees weekly, not because she needs to, but because she has learned the value of talking about her experiences. On the evening before her birthday, she sits down at her desk and writes a letter. It is addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone, a reflection on her journey and the lessons she has learned along the way. She writes about fear and hope, about darkness and light, about the incredible capacity of the human spirit to survive what seems unsurvivable. She writes about her parents, whose love never wavered even when hope seemed foolish. She writes about Detective Morrison and the investigators who never gave up, who believed she was still out there when the world had forgotten. And she writes about the future, about her plans to open a veterinary practice that will offer reduced-rate services to families who cannot afford full fees. She wants to give back, she explains, to create something good from something terrible, to transform her suffering into service. It is not justice, exactly, because nothing can undo what was done to her. But it is victory, in its own way, proof that Thomas Whitfield failed in his ultimate aim. He wanted to take her life. He only postponed it. On the morning of her birthday, Bethany wakes to find her apartment decorated with streamers and balloons. Her parents have let themselves in with the spare key, and they are in the kitchen preparing breakfast, laughing and bickering the way they always have. The scent of pancakes fills the air, and sunlight streams through the windows, and for a moment, everything feels impossibly, beautifully normal. They eat together, exchange gifts, and share stories and memories. Susan Chambers gives Bethany a photograph she has had framed, a picture from her 17th birthday party, the last image taken before everything changed. In the photo, Bethany is laughing, surrounded by friends and family, cake crumbs on her chin and fairy lights twinkling in the background. Susan wants her daughter to have it, she says, as a reminder that the girl in that photo is still here, still alive, still capable of that same joy. Bethany looks at the photograph for a long time. Then she places it on her mantelpiece, next to her veterinary textbooks and a small ceramic bird she has kept since childhood. She turns to her parents, and she smiles. And in that smile is everything: the pain and the triumph, the loss and the recovery, the darkness and the light that followed it. This is the story of Bethany Chambers, a girl who disappeared after an online meetup tied to a celebration and who was found, against all odds, 8 years later. It is a story about the dangers that lurk behind screens and smiles, about the importance of never giving up, about the resilience of families and communities when faced with unimaginable challenges. But most of all, it is a story about victory, about a young woman who refused to let her worst experience define her final chapter. If this story has touched you, if it has made you think about the people in your life or the dangers that exist in our connected world, I ask you to share it. Share it with parents who need to know the warning signs. Share it with teenagers who deserve to understand the risks. Share it with anyone who needs a reminder that hope is never foolish and that love, in the end, is stronger than cruelty. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that matter, stories of justice and recovery, of darkness overcome and light restored. Because as long as there are people willing to listen, there will be stories worth telling. Bethany Chambers is alive. She is thriving. And her story is not over. It is just beginning.